The starting point for today, just to briefly recap one of the main points from yesterday, is that and what you just said is that we're living in a world that has been drained of the sacred, a world indeed that is devoid of really any operating guiding narrative. You know, we've tried a secular narrative, we've tried narratives, a no narrative, and things are not getting better. We are, as it were, running on fumes. You know, we're witnessing a slow motion collapse of ways of thinking, of social modes, of being in relation to others. Our collective social life is upheld by a moral framework that we simply take for granted, you know, valuing individuals as being of intrinsic worth, valuing things like individual freedom, the golden rule, basic elements of a moral framework that uphold our social life, but whose theological underpinnings have been fatally undermined. And it was, I think, very well described by the passage from Peter Berger that I read yesterday, that this collapse of the of our moral framework is felt more acutely in some parts of the world than others. There's still some parts of the world where, let's say, traditional religious modes of thinking and being are still relatively unaffected by this encroachment of the secular age. And then there are other parts of the world where, including, we might say, the developed West, where we look around and all we see are smoldering ruins. You know, there's no sort of framework that we can all agree on that we can build on. They're just competing local tribalistic narratives. And so the project for the next few days is to try to articulate elements in a replacement narrative. But I immediately want to say it isn't a matter of swapping one narrative for another. It isn't a matter of saying all these past narratives were wrong and let me give you, you know, the true narrative, or let us reveal the true narrative, because it is an intrinsic feature of the world that there will be different approaches and different ways of being, a feature and not a bug. And so the replacement narrative that we articulate has to be something more like a meta-narrative. It has to be a way of thinking which embraces and validates somehow simultaneously the sacred and the secular approach, the Eastern and the Western approach. They all have to be shown to be true and valid within their own particular perspective. There's a beautiful passage in one of Baha'u'llah's mystical tablets that was newly translated in The Call of the Divine Beloved, where Baha'u'llah addresses this fundamental fact of human existence, let us say, that there are differing opinions and there's no way to get past that. There's no way to force everyone to think the same. Even if our end goal is unity, it's a unity in diversity, which is our end goal, not a unity in uniformity. And the way Baha'u'llah says this, and this is so beautifully, in The Call of the Divine Beloved, and this is in the third tablet in the volume, from the letter Ba to the letter Ha. And Baha'u'llah says it in the following terms. He says, since all do not possess the same degree of spiritual understanding, this is paragraph 6, certain statements will inevitably be made, and there shall arise, as a consequence, as many differing opinions as there are human minds, and as many divergent beliefs as there are created things. This is certain and settled and can in no wise be averted. Now it is clear that some are virtuous, others are sinful, and still others are rebellious. One must call the people to love and faithfulness, to zeal and contentment, that the sinful may be admonished and the ranks of the virtuous may swell. Nor is it possible that there be no sinners, for so long as the name, the ever-forgiving, shineth resplendent above the horizon of existence, there will be sinners in the world of creation. For the latter cannot appear without the former, and the former cannot exist without the latter. Our aim is that thou shouldst urge all the believers to show forth kindness and mercy, and to overlook certain shortcomings among them, that differences may be dispelled, true harmony be established, and the censure and reproach, the hatred and dissension seen among the peoples of former times may not arise anew. So Baha'u'llah seems to be recommending a posture of forbearance and tolerance, not even contemplating a future state in which all of these different perspectives, all of these different narratives, let's say, are going to be reduced to a single one to create that sort of artificial unity, for example, that a single doctrine might be able to impose. And so going back then to the map metaphor, because I think the map metaphor is a way that we can imagine the possibility of this simultaneous existence of different kinds of narrative frameworks. A point that I didn't mention yesterday that I wanted to include is that if we think of scientific theories as maps, as narratives, sometimes it's the case that you might have multiple different levels of approximation, different models to describe the same reality. And all of these models might be correct and true within their own sphere of application. So let me take 3 examples. The first example is probably our model of the universe, which is of the greatest antiquity, and which, by the way, we still, in our everyday lives, go about as though it were true. And this model is that the Earth is flat, that objects always fall down, that we're traversing an Earth and a universe in which the Earth is at the center of everything and it's flat. And that's actually not a bad approximation. Unless one is going to get on an airplane and fly to another continent, unless one is going to get on a sailing ship and sail the seas, for most of history, where most people never moved more than a few miles from their place of birth, the theory, let's call it, that the Earth is flat was a perfectly reasonable and perfectly accurate one. One could navigate one's world perfectly well with that set of ideas. The second narrative is that of Newtonian physics. So in this narrative, the Earth is not flat, it's a spherical or mostly spherical. We're held onto the Earth by a force of gravity, which can be very simply described by a very simple equation that we can learn in our first year of physics class. And that equation is so powerful, it's able to predict our motion around the Earth with such precision that we could launch rockets to the moon. We could send rockets to other planets using just this equation to describe our connection to the Earth and the pull of the Earth's gravity. But this narrative, this map of reality in all its simplicity, we know for the last century to actually not be the last word in gravity, that there is another far more mathematically complicated way of describing our connection to the Earth, describing the force of gravity, which Einstein articulated in the early 20th century, the theory of general relativity. And when you compare the predictions of the theory of general relativity when it comes to things like rocket ships orbiting the Earth, they predict almost identically the same thing. It's as though you have two different theories with two very different narrative frameworks. In one of these, the Newtonian theory, space and time are fixed, eternally fixed background objects, let's say, or background concepts within which one places the Earth and the rocket ship and everything else that's moving within the Earth's field of gravity. But in the theory of general relativity, space and time are almost like a fabric. They warp and stretch according to the kinds of masses and energies that exist within this fabric. It's a very different conception of a very fundamental concept. Our whole idea of space and time is completely different in the theory of general relativity than it is in the Newtonian model. But the two theories predict our movements in the sort of local sense with almost identical precision. So taking a pragmatic approach, well, which theory would we choose? If all of our experience was confined to the Earth and maybe sending spaceships to the moon or something like that, we might never need the theory of general relativity. But when we go outside this, let's say, limited sphere of the Earth, and we start looking at some neighboring planets, like the orbit of the planet Mercury, the closest planet to the sun, and we look at its orbit, and over the course of thousands of years, the orbit, which is not perfectly circular, it's a little bit oblong, it's an ellipse, we find that elliptical orbit precesses slightly as Mercury makes many thousands of passes around the sun. It's the orbit of it, the shape of the orbit orbits along with the orbit of Mercury itself. And this is where a distinction appears between Newton's theory and the theory of general relativity. A very small distinction. In 1,000 years, this orbit of Mercury might shift by just a few degrees. And so this brings us to, I think, a really interesting conclusion about the nature of scientific investigation, which we can bring into our understanding of spiritual matters. And that is that sometimes the approximation is just about as accurate as the fuller theory. Sometimes you can be 99.9% accurate in making a prediction and congratulate yourself that you have the right theory, whereas in reality your theory is based upon completely wrong assumptions about the fundamentals. So if you used Newton's theory to calculate the orbit of Mercury, you would be very pleased with yourself that it had this incredible accuracy, 99.9% accuracy or even greater. You might not realize, if you didn't also have access to the general theory of relativity, you might not realize that although you're achieving this great prediction and you seem to have this great predictive power using this theory, the assumptions of this theory are nevertheless completely wrong. The assumption that space and time are these fixed, separate, and unchangeable quantities, unchangeable and fixed realities. So the fact that we're able to, that something works, going back to this argument of pragmatism from yesterday, the fact that something works is no guarantee that it represents anything even close to the ultimate reality of things. But what are we to do? Because all we have access to are these sorts of things. All we have access to in building our theories is our observations of the world around us. I think one of the things this ultimately and inevitably forces us to is a deep sense of epistemic humility. Humility that, a sense that although we have and can employ these very powerful methods, the scientific method, assuming that nature speaks the language of mathematics. Although we have these very extremely powerful methods to investigate the world around us and make predictions of things, the frameworks that we build using these methods may nevertheless be very far away from the true reality of things. So why did I take so much time to bring this up? It's because I just want to sort of put a pin in this and raise the question, and I won't maybe address it directly at the moment, but we'll come back to it in a session or two. Could it be that certain theological frameworks that we take to be absolute are really Newtonian approximations? Could monotheism itself, which we may take to be very fundamental, there is one God, God creates the world, God sends messengers every 1,000 years. It can be stated in a few words, very simply. Could this be a sort of Newtonian approximation? It is a theory which has high predictive value, to use a scientific term. It's effective. It's effective in helping to orient human life in a certain way. It's effective in helping to orient human societies. So human life, both in its individual and collective spheres. But maybe the ultimate reality of things is far beyond the fixed space-time that a traditional robust monotheism may represent. And if that's the case, then does that mean we necessarily reject it and say, oh, it's wrong? Well, we're not rejecting Newtonian dynamics either. We may realize that all of our theories are ultimately going to be faint approximations of whatever the truth of things are, but that realization doesn't lead us to the rejection of these theories. That realization just enables us to understand that there may be multiple maps, there may be multiple theories that could be simultaneously valid within their own sphere of operation. So a physicist has no problem learning Newtonian dynamics, and at another stage learning about the dynamics implicit in the theory of general relativity, knowing that these two are, that one is in some way an approximation of the other, or one can be reducible to the other. So there can be multiple simultaneous frames of reference. There can even be a hierarchy in a sense. I mean, no one would say that Newton's laws are more final than Einstein's equations. But sometimes the least accurate or more approximative theory is actually better for certain purposes. In the vast majority of cases, physicists use Newton's laws and not Einstein's equations. So taking this idea, which hopefully opens up to us the possibility of thinking about religious systems in similar ways, looking at the human history of our encounter with the divine and our attempts to systematize the understanding that we have of the divine in different sorts of religious systems. Some of them monotheistic, some of them polytheistic. We only have to go back a couple of thousand years before we have very robust polytheistic systems. Some of them non-theistic, speaking more of the Eastern modes of religious thought. No definite concept of a single creator God, but nevertheless translating into spiritual posture in the world, which harmonizes so well with the spiritual posture and the moral framework of religious systems in the West. Hopefully this train of thought can lead us to think about different religious narratives in a similar way. But what I set out to do, what I'm going to attempt to set out to do, is to try to start to articulate a narrative within which all of these different systems of thinking, religious thinking, spiritual thinking, secular thinking, to try to start to articulate some meta framework or some meta narrative within which all of them have a place and all of them have relative validity. And where I want to start is to go back to history and to try to build out an idea about where we are in this historical moment and where we're going. As we were discussing yesterday with this collapse of narratives, one of the consequences of that has been, at least in certain quarters, a collapse in the idea that history itself really has any kind of direction. And it's replaced by this idea that history is simply a record of essentially random events. It's a history of power struggles, essentially meaningless rise and fall of ruling hierarchies. Beneath it all, of course, never really recorded on the pages of history, are everyday people living their everyday lives. But what the historians do is they gather up the records, which are highly biased by what the rulers chiseled into stone before they themselves turned to dust. And they take these fragments of what happened in the past few thousand years and they put them together, put them in textbooks, and for the convenience of the reader, they divide it into chapters. But ultimately, history is there's no ultimate motive power behind it, and there's ultimately no directionality to it. That's where I think a lot of thinkers now find themselves in the absence of any larger narrative. What I want to suggest is the opposite of that. And I want to try to substantiate this proposition with a little bit of, although I'm not a historian, I'm a physicist sort of intruding a bit into history. But hopefully you will so take this with that with a grain of salt. Imagine that history actually is a living and organic thing. That history charts the birth, the growth, the maturation, the death and rebirth of societies. Our window onto history is quite narrow. It's only about 5,000 years where we have written records. But even within that narrow window, and if we add to that the evidence, archaeological evidence that we can dig up out of the ground as opposed to reading on stone tablets, we do see clear evidence of cyclical patterns of rise and fall of societies in different parts of the world. And insofar as these historical and archaeological records reveal, it seems as though history can be described by periods of stability, of relative stability, that are punctuated by more rapid periods of breakdown and perhaps leaps forward. A few examples of these. One of these, well, I would highly recommend for those who are interested in thinking about history in this way, the best-selling book by Yuval Harari called *Sapiens*. I think it was mentioned yesterday. This book does a great job, I think, of projecting our imaginations back well before any written records, really to something like 100,000 BC or so, where we can imagine around that time there was one of the great and first leaps forward in human history, which one might call the birth of abstract thinking. Perhaps that was the real Adam and Eve event, or the birth of human consciousness, awareness at a level that didn't exist before. Prior to this birth of abstract thought, human organization was constrained by trust relationships that couldn't go beyond who you personally had a relationship with. Relationships of trust, I mean, you couldn't trust that someone you had never met before wouldn't stab you in the back. And so the structure of human societies 100,000 years ago, were limited in size to the number of people you could sort of keep in the number of relationships you could keep in your head at one moment. And the sociologist, I think he's a sociologist, Robin Dunbar, has even put a number on this. And he says the number is about 150. 150 relationships that human brains are wired to be able to process at any given time. That's the extent of our friend network. Professor Dunbar said it defines friend as the person who, if you were to wander into a bar and you saw this person, you wouldn't think twice about sitting down at the same table. So with that definition of friend, there's about 150 people in our friend network. And it's interesting, actually, that subsequent research, not just archaeological research on the size of ancient human habitations, other sorts of research on psychological research, and in various ways, this number seems to be more or less confirmed. As long as we can't have more than about 150 friends, we can't organize ourselves in units larger than that. And so that constrains humanity to exist at a sort of tribal level until we're able to make the conceptual leap that enables us to see people we've never met before as somehow part of a trusted group. So what was required for humanity to leap forward to the next degree of its self-organization was the abstract concept of an identity in a larger sort of tribal network. And maybe that was signified by the kind of clothing you wear, or in the kind of tattoo you might have. Some marker perhaps went along with that, but there was some. But it ultimately was an abstract kind of a marker that allowed you to think about your identity in larger terms than simply who you personally had a relationship with. This was as Harari describes, was just a truly momentous step forward in our history, because it suddenly allowed us, now that we are endowed with abstract thought, it suddenly allowed us to create structures and ways of thinking, tools to organize ourselves at a much higher level. Ideas of, for instance, value, the ability to barter for goods, the ability to create this very abstract concept of money, which is really an object that has symbolic value before you have abstract thought, all you can do is trade one object for another. To come up with the idea of money requires a leap of abstract thinking. So this can be thought of, and Harari, of course, does a fantastic job of making this idea come alive. That there was at least this one leap forward in human history. We might call that the birth of humanity in a way. But there have been other leaps forward throughout the millennia that followed. And I can't claim to have an exhaustive list of them, and perhaps depending on which historian or which sociologist you ask, you might get a different sort of list. But one might add to this first conceptual leap, the birth of humanity, the agricultural revolution that happened around 10,000 years ago. And with this comes the birth of culture and writing, and a shift in our theological frameworks from those that are based on hunter-gatherer societies to those that are agrarian societies. We might call this the infancy of the human race. There is another leap forward described by Karl Jaspers, who gave it the name the axial age. And he identifies a period of time around 500 to say 1000 BC, around that area, where somehow simultaneously in different parts of the world, there was a conceptual revolution. The agrarian revolution was well established. You had, fairly large societies existing already for quite a long period of time. But what happens during this first axial age, this axial age described by Jaspers, is it's sort of a conceptual revolution which is visible in the religious systems that appear during that time across the world, from the Buddha in the East and Lao Tzu to the Hebrew prophets in Israel and the Greek philosophers, Zoroastrianism, more or less appear and flourish within a relatively narrow band of time, a few centuries. We might call this the childhood of the human race. And extending this metaphor of leaps forward in civilization, we might also look at the scientific revolution of a few centuries ago, which we might think of as being in the kind of distant past, but in terms of the human history, it actually is a fairly recent event, and we're still, in a way, processing the consequences of the scientific revolution. I think it was Whitehead, the philosopher, Albert Whitehead, who suggested that some of the most profound ideas that appear to the human mind may take 1,000 years before they work their way into general consciousness. Whether that's true or not, I think it is true that at the civilizational level, certain ideas truly take centuries to become fully effectuated in the world. The scientific revolution, although it happened several centuries ago, still has not touched certain parts of the world. And even those of us who think that we live fully in the modern age and in the scientific realm still are subject to very superstitious modes of thought. So this, what we might call this a second axial age. And the second axial age, which was sparked by the scientific revolution, signals another massive inflection point in human civilization, which we might call the beginnings of our adolescent period. The great changes that this brought about and is still bringing about in human society can be, I think, can in some ways be summarized by some of the principles of the European Enlightenment of the 1700s. And when I talk about the Enlightenment, I hope for the purposes of this discussion to bracket some of the bad things that happened because of the Enlightenment. There's a racist legacy of Enlightenment thinking as well, of using the power of early science towards the maintenance of racist ways of thinking. I want to talk about the ideal Enlightenment, which comprises a few points. First of all, the celebration of the mind and of the scientific method, and the idea that with the application of the scientific method, humanity can approach a state of continual progress. Before the scientific revolution, the idea of progress wasn't even really a thing. You know, we now take progress for granted. The idea that every generation will in some way be better off than the generation before, because our knowledge will have increased, science will continue its inexorable march forward, and tomorrow will always be better than yesterday. This idea is really the child of the scientific revolution and this Enlightenment ideal. And I mean, even if we imagine, you know, the ancient Greeks, how did the ancient Greeks look at history? The ancient Greeks really invented, in a way, application of rational thought to an investigation of the world, although they didn't discover the scientific method. For the ancient Greeks, where did they look for the source of wisdom? They didn't imagine themselves as progressing forward into ever expanding knowledge of the world. The Greeks looked backward in time to ancient Egypt as the pinnacle of human civilization. They saw themselves as living in a sort of dark age following this great height of civilization. A third, and so we have the celebration of the mind as being a great sort of signpost of Enlightenment thought. Secondly, the embrace of progress. And thirdly, the questioning of presumptive authorities of the past was a hallmark of Enlightenment thinking, a hallmark of this, let's say, adolescent leap forward of human civilization. And just as the questioning of authority is a hallmark of human adolescence at the individual level, it also was a hallmark of our collective leap forward in Enlightenment thinking. And it began with questioning things like the astronomical authorities of the past, those who said that the sun goes around the earth. And it took, as we know, tremendous effort of many brilliant minds in the face of sustained opposition by religious authorities to establish the reality of that the earth actually goes around the sun. The other presumptive authorities of the past being challenged successively, authorities in medicine, authorities in physics and chemistry, authorities in politics, the idea that the king ruled by divine right was successfully challenged during the Enlightenment, and we see the birth of modern democracies. And then finally, the challenging the presumptive religious authorities of the past, and we see the first stages of that in the Protestant Reformation. Although we're not finished, I think, by any means with the impact of Enlightenment thinking on religion. What I want to suggest, sort of to try to paint a picture of history and historical processes in a coherent way, is that even today, several hundred years after the birth of the scientific revolution, we're still within that a kind of second axial age. And we're at the later stages of it, where these Enlightenment principles, these principles of the application of reason and science, are for the first time being expressed within a new kind of spiritual framework. I want to make the suggestion that the Baha'i faith is the spiritual heir of the Enlightenment and its fulfillment in the realm of religion, just as Enlightenment ideals were fulfilled in other aspects of human thought. And just to bring out a few parallels, I mentioned these three real pillars of Enlightenment thinking: the primacy and role of reason, the idea of progress, and the questioning of presumptive authorities of the past. We find all three of these very centrally located within the Baha'i writings. Regarding the central role of reason, Abdu'l-Baha opens his treatise, The Secret of Divine Civilization, with the following paragraph on the power of reason. And I just select this one passage out of what maybe dozens of different passages that we could have picked. But this is how he begins that treatise. He says, "Praise and thanksgiving be unto Providence that out of all the realities in existence, he has chosen the reality of man and honored it with intellect and wisdom, the two most luminous lights in either world. Through the agency of this great endowment, he has in every epoch cast on the mirror of creation new and wonderful configurations. If we look objectively upon the world of being, it will become apparent that from age to age, the temple of existence has continually been embellished with a fresh grace and distinguished with an ever-varying splendor, deriving from wisdom and the power of thought. This supreme emblem of God stands first in the order of creation and first in rank, taking precedence over all created things. Witness to it the holy tradition. Before all else, God created the mind. From the dawn of creation, it was made to be revealed in the temple of man. Sanctified is the Lord, who with the dazzling rays of this strange heavenly power has made our world of darkness the envy of the worlds of light. What a beautiful, send up to the idea of the mind and the power of rational thinking as being a great motive force in the world. I think Enlightenment thinkers would applaud this approach. The idea of progress also, as we know, is very much at the core of the Baha'i writings. I only have to cite the famous, well-known statement by Baha'u'llah that all men have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. So the idea of our being a part of something which is in motion, and indeed motion forwards, is at the core of our own self-understanding, as it was for Enlightenment thinkers. And when it comes to questioning of presumptive authorities, that is absolutely at the center. Again, we can turn to so many different passages in our writings, but why don't we just start with the very first paragraph of the Book of Certitude, the Kitab-i-Iqan, where Baha'u'llah states that man can never hope to attain unto the knowledge of the All-Glorious, can never quaff from the stream of divine knowledge and wisdom, can never enter the abode of immortality, nor partake of the cup of divine nearness and favor, unless and until he ceases to regard the words and deeds of mortal men as a standard for the true understanding and recognition of God and his prophets. I mean, what a powerful sort of opening statement of this idea that one just can't rely on the existing religious power structures of the day. Baha'u'llah spends so much of part one of the Kitab-i-Iqan excoriating the divines and their casting a veil between the people and the truth. So Baha'u'llah is, I think, in this way, very much in line with that spirit of the Enlightenment, which is to question authority. And of course, the idea that we are all given the spiritual responsibility of the independent investigation of reality, which we consider to be one of our core teachings, is also, I think, very much in line with that. So if we are in this climacteric, if we're in the midst of this great transition in human history, and we can call this perhaps the birth or the birth of our entrance into from adolescence into maturity, is one way to describe this historical process of the last few centuries. Then when we start stepping back, we look at history then as an organic process where humanity has had a birth, an infancy, a childhood. We're in the later stages of adolescence. What comes next? Any good narrative or meta-narrative has to point the way forward. And just as with a child who is entering adolescence, an adolescent has no choice but to move forward into maturity. An adolescent can't go back to being a child. Likewise, it is not an option for us when we consider where to go collectively. It's not an option for us to go back to any of the old failed narratives and the false certainties that they embodied. We can't unring the bell. We know too much about the world to go back to simplistic ways of thinking. We can't go back to the innocent certainty of of Thomas Aquinas and his 5 ways of proving God's existence, for example. There's just been too much water under the bridge for us to think so simply about the deepest questions. We also can't go back, just as we can't go back to our traditional religious narratives, we also can't go back to innocent views of science as being our savior. It was, I think, Oppenheimer who, after the testing of the hydrogen bomb, famously said, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." Science has also lost its innocence. We have to go forward. So what is it that we're moving forward into? And I want to make the hopefully not too controversial suggestion that if we are going to continue to use this metaphor of human society as being a living thing, then adolescence will be followed by a long, stable period of maturity, what Baha'is would call the golden age. And that period can be long indeed, but that ultimately it will be followed by decline and death. And then something else will be reborn from it. What do we see on the largest scales? And this, I don't think will be controversial, although there's a well-known Baha'i quotation that says this is the day which will not be followed by night. So we might imagine that what we're building, the world civilization that we're setting about building, will last forever, won't be followed by night. But that would run against the whole organic conception that we have of history, of religion. We just usually don't think about what comes after that, because it's so far in the future, we probably don't have to worry about it anyway. We're talking many thousands of years into the future. But just because what we're trying to do is step far enough back that we can glimpse a sort of a grander scheme of things than even the narrow window of human history, and even the narrow window of just the thousands of years to come. If we zoom out even larger, if we look on the cosmic scale, what do we see when we look out into the universe? We see small, temporary islands of stability in the midst of chaos. We see planets circling suns, maybe in stable orbits for billions of years, but ultimately there is no permanence in that. Every star, every sun is destined, is fated to run out of its nuclear fuel and ultimately either vanish or either destroy itself in a cataclysmic supernova or go cold and dark. That's the fate of every star, and then of the planets that circle around it. What of the civilizations that may exist on those planets? Every civilization has a lifespan, and that lifespan implies not just birth and adolescence and maturity, but ultimately death. But that death provides the seeds and provides the matrix for the rebirth of the new. And so what I'm suggesting is, on the very largest scales, a view of history which is more cyclical than it is linear. We find circular motion pervasive in the cosmos. It's one of the most fundamental physical phenomena that we observe. From our understanding of our past history, it seems to be upheld that there are cyclical birth and decline and fall of civilizations. Arnold Toynbee is one writer who does a great job of fleshing out this idea of the cyclicality of history. And we see this also in the cosmic domain. And this is, by the way, exactly how Abdu'l-Baha describes the bigger picture in chapter 41 of Some Answered Questions. And I think for me, this is a key element in the universal narrative that we will be building. This key element, and there will be a handful of them, and this is one of them. It's the idea that ultimately there are universal cycles. Everything, however grand, ultimately has an end. And Abdu'l-Baha writes in chapter 41 of Some Answered Questions, he says that when a cycle comes to a close, a new one is inaugurated, and the previous cycle, on account of the momentous events which transpire, vanishes so entirely from memory as to leave behind no record or trace. Thus, as you are aware, we have no record of 20,000 years ago, even though we established before through rational arguments that life on this earth is very ancient, not 100 or 200,000 or even 1 or 2 million years. It is ancient indeed, and the records and traces of ancient times have been entirely obliterated. It may seem like a bit of a downer to emphasize this, or even to bring up the idea that every civilization has an expiration date attached to it, because we would like to believe that we're in the process of building something that will forever endure. But the realities of the universe as we understand it, the astronomical reality, the cosmological realities of the universe, is that no configuration, however stable, will forever endure. It's, since all life is, as we can imagine it, is dependent upon the nuclear fuel of stars, unless we can find some way of escaping between the stars. But that would lead us a bit far afield. But we should leave that as a possibility, that even if a planet is destroyed through these cataclysmic cosmic processes, it is possible for life and intelligence to reach a state in which it's able to traverse the stars. And so it's possible for us to escape this cycle, these cycles of birth and death at that level. But I wanted to just bring that out as an element in the narrative, partly because when you really accept the fact that there is no permanence, when you accept the fact that even the golden age to come will ultimately have an end, that there will be a cycle of decline following a cycle of maturity, one comes, I think, to some fundamental understanding about things, that it's not about the goal, but it's about the process. Because there is no permanent goal out there. I mean, whatever goal is reached, whatever thresholds are attained, whatever great leaps forward in civilization, as we've had several in the past, in the end, it will ultimately result in disintegration and rebirth, with the possible total erasure of all memory of the past cycle. To imagine that all human knowledge might someday be erased, to imagine that all great works of art and architecture, that the symphonies of Beethoven and the works of Shakespeare will at some point be utterly vanished in some cataclysm. Where does one go with that? Does one think, okay, therefore nothing matters? That's one direction you could go with that. Or the other direction you could go with that is, I get it. What matters ultimately is the process of creation, and not that arbitrary moment when the thing gets created. What matters in the progress of human life, both on the individual and the collective level, is not the goal that we attain, but the process we go through in attaining it. The reason I think this is an important sort of building block in a new narrative is that it gives us the possibility of understanding cosmically the processes we're seeing as a continual state of waking up. The universe can be thought of as being in this continual state of waking up. It's not like waiting until a time, a billion years from now, when suddenly everything comes together. It's right now it's happening. And it was happening a billion years ago, and it'll be happening billions of years from now. A process of waking up, a process of becoming conscious. And what we're involved in today in this worldwide community of people who are coming together to transform the world is we're involved in taking consciousness to that next level. The title for this course is Impelling the Development of Consciousness, and it was inspired by a statement prepared at the direction of the House of Justice called One Common Faith, that was published, I can't remember now, more than 20 years ago, I think, around 20 years ago or so. And one of the statements in that, in One Common Faith, has always stuck out to me as being very, very fundamental in changing our conception of who we are and what we're doing. It goes as follows. Baha'u'llah has not brought into existence a new religion to stand beside the present multiplicity of sectarian organizations. Rather, has he recast the whole conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. That's on page 23 of One Common Faith. Rather, has he recast the whole conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. It's that idea that I probably should have started with, because it really is the formative thought behind this entire course. The idea that we're replacing an old narrative of religion, or rather maybe adding to an old narrative of religion, because the old narrative of religion still has juice, you know, it still has vitality in life. It still speaks to many people. What this sentence does for me is it introduces the possibility of another way of looking at it. Maybe it's to a question that was raised yesterday. Maybe it's maybe there's a hierarchy, and maybe this is a higher way of looking at it, or lower. It doesn't really matter. You know, maybe this is the Einstein, you know, the general theory of relativity way of looking at religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. And maybe the Newtonian approximation is, you know, God has come again and brought a new prophet and a new book. But these are ultimately different ways of saying the same thing. To talk about God and prophets and holy books is to simply a different language game, to use a phrase of Wittgenstein, to say the same thing. And the same thing is, it's about ultimately impelling the development of consciousness. And what prophets do from age to age is stimulate and catalyze this development of consciousness. And what makes this, I think, such a hopeful start of a new narrative is that the idea of consciousness is so powerful and multifaceted. It extends, first of all, beyond human consciousness, and it can be thought to be something that characterizes entities beyond the human. What I'm saying is, and suggesting, is that other life on the planet also possesses consciousness in its own degree. Even what we think of as inanimate objects possess consciousness. But here we have to be careful, because I'm not using consciousness in the common dictionary sense of it, like human consciousness. I'm using it more in the sense that Abdu'l-Baha uses the word spirit. We can almost take the word consciousness and swap it out for the word spirit, and we're almost having the same conversation. we might actually be having exactly the same conversation. We've just switched language games. You can talk about consciousness in a room full of philosophers and still be taken seriously. But if you start talking about spirit, you're now entering into a different language game. And for certain groups of people, they don't want to hear about spirit, because now we're into the sort of woo-woo zone of religion and gods that's all sort of water under the bridge. Consciousness is still an interesting thing. It's still a very active subject of research. But what's really the difference between spirit and consciousness? How does Abdu'l-Baha define spirit? In so many of his tablets and talks, Baha'u'llah does as well, but Abdu'l-Baha does it, I think, even articulates it with even more precision. Abdu'l-Baha talks about spirit as something which exists throughout all the levels of creation. He describes creation almost in hierarchical sense. You have kingdoms, the mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, the human kingdom, and beyond that, other kingdoms which represent different states of consciousness. Every kingdom has its spirit. What is the spirit of the mineral kingdom? Well, it's the force of cohesion. It is the ties of mutuality that bind all matter together. That is an aspect of consciousness at the very lowest level. There are higher manifestations of the force of consciousness, culminating in what we commonly talk about consciousness being human self-awareness. But we can think of consciousness as being something which is an all-pervasive field almost, that's present everywhere, just as the Baha'i writings talk about spirit being present everywhere. So I'm going to be going into this in more detail in the next sessions. But where I wanted to end this session with, we're ending a little bit early so we can have more, I think, conversation about it. And to try to recap, I took a long time sort of trying to articulate a way of thinking about human history that situates us in a certain context, that situates us within an ages-long process in which collectively human society is becoming more self-aware, which perhaps was sparked, as early as 100,000 years ago by a kind of leap forward in consciousness, and which has only enabled the continuing expression of human potentiality as civilization has advanced in stage after stage, as human societies have become larger and more complex, allowing the unlocking of greater and greater degrees of potential in these sort of stair-step pattern of periods of stability and then periods of leaps forward. All of this I suggest as a way of understanding the evolution of consciousness on this planet. And as understanding the present moment as being a particularly significant leap forward in consciousness, where for the first time we can be conscious of our existence on this planet as a single species, sharing certain goals, sharing certain challenges, sharing perhaps one of the foremost of which is the awareness of the boundaries of the planet that we live on. For the first time, we can be conscious of that. For the first time in this age, we've explored all the continents and all the oceans. That wasn't too long ago when we didn't know about the existence of entire continents. And we're now at a point where we realize that the Earth has limits, and that the current ways of being, the narratives that we have adopted that have gotten us to this point, narratives which include, let's say, the unfettered power of individuals to do whatever they want, which got us to a certain point. But when the boundaries of the planet come into play, it requires a shift and a leap forward in consciousness, which involves an awareness of those limitations, an awareness of the existence and rights of others in a way that that historically has not been a part of our awareness of things. So I wanted to suggest a historical process of the human species progressing through organic stages that are similar, that recapitulate in a macrocosmic sense the microcosmic stages that individual humans go through from birth through maturity and so forth. And then I wanted to further situate that view of human history as our now sort of approaching this culminating point of our adolescence. I wanted to further situate it in a larger cosmic sense of our, although we think of our society as being on this permanent upward trajectory, if we zoom out enough, we realize that we are simply on an ascending arc of a cycle, which ultimately will close and other cycles will open. And that fact of cyclicality, which Abdu'l-Baha drives home in chapter 41 of Some Answered Questions, has profound implications for how we think about meaning, how we think about what we're about in the world and what we're doing. To my mind, those implications involve the way we experience every single moment of every single day. We so often tend to be goal driven. It's all about getting through whatever in order to reach that goal that we have set for ourselves. And I don't want to say that setting goals is not a great thing, but I want to say that from this sort of cosmic perspective of evolution of consciousness and cycles, it may shift our awareness of what's important and center it more in the moment, because we realize that the real purpose of existence is being expressed in this moment rather than at some indefinable point in the future. So that's where I'll leave the thoughts up to this point. Tomorrow, I will be further expanding on this idea of consciousness, and I'll be adding in the additional, let's say, foundation stones in the framework. And to give you a preview, we'll be talking about love and unity and a few other basic ideas and how they all link together. So why don't we pause here for questions and comments? I hope this wasn't too much on the historical angle. And again, not being a historian, I'm kind of stumbling my way through, and others would do a far better job.
Thank you once again. And I'm going to open up for questions. I'll try and keep an eye on the questions. Parto, would you like to start? Because I've seen your hand first.
Thank you. Hi, Steven. This is Parto from Finland.
Parto, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Long time.
I love being with you in Akuto. It seems like a forever ago.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, and sorry for being immediately using my voice, but anyway. So just a little comment about the process, the journey being the point, and so forth, which you mentioned. I of course totally agree with you. Just in terms of discussing these things in the modern society, since it is quite popular for people to talk, it's not the destination, it's the process. Mm-hmm. There's always a danger of misunderstanding, which I'm sure you didn't. I mean, I know what you meant, but the thing is that from the Baha'i perspective and the perspective that I understand it, I guess the point is that we do have a goal. We
are building something, yes.
Exactly. So we are approaching something, but the point is that that something is unattainable, yet infinitely approachable. So there is a direction. It's somewhat vague, somewhat fuzzy, and our understanding of it mm-hmm. proved never crystallized to a full measure. So mm-hmm. it's fundamentally a different type of journey that we are talking about than the journey the rank and file of people in the world generally mean, which is a very pointless, directionless, often, not always, but often. So in that sense, also the products of civilization, the fruits of civilization are not only that the process of making them, but in making them, we have built into the potential of humanity, which is eternal, which is fundamentally absolute. And we have been building into that. So even if we would lose all the sonnets of Shakespeare, still it has built something in the spiritual world. The very fact that he produced those works of spirit, even though their material or physical manifestations are gone, like our material manifestation, which is our body, will be gone, but not the soul that is being built by that body. So just wanted to, maybe you want to say something about that?
No, that's a very good and interesting point. You know, what is being accumulated? You know, we feel like we have to believe that what we've produced is accumulating something somehow. You know, there's a tally somewhere, and it may be in the invisible realm if it's not on this planet, because now we realize this planet has a lifespan to it. We know that everything's going to eventually be destroyed. Atom by atom, everything's going to be separated. We still, in our minds, have to believe that something is being tallied up, and that when it's all over and when every trace vanishes, that, well, at least God remembers it. And somewhere in the spiritual realm, there's still an accumulation of something so that the next generation builds on the first. That may be the case. I can't say that it is or isn't. But when Abdu'l-Baha talks in 41 of Some Answered Questions, he doesn't talk about the next generation or the next cycle building on the last. He says every trace and every memory of the last cycle is effaced. Now, maybe Abdu'l-Baha just isn't going into whatever's going on in the mind of God, but it's one of those fundamentally unanswerable questions. I think it's reasonable to ask: does it have to be the case that there is some invisible tally of things? Is the purpose of creation somehow short-circuited if we truly believe all the way through to the end this idea that it's process and not goal? And then, well, then what happens to goals? It's not a matter of saying the goals don't matter. You know, one still sets goals in this world because they enable the process to happen better.
Mm.
I don't know. I don't have an answer to it. Just more questions and thoughts.
May I make a comment myself? I'm having this idea that, you know, I'm getting ideas of like these pillars of compassion and it's not punishment, but what's the other one? The idea that there was, you know, our own lifespan, it creates this finiteness that we, you know, I wonder, is it that is imprinting ourselves on everything, like our own sense of our own death is kind of giving us this narrative of that everything must have an end, or everything must have a goal in a sense. But like there are so many discussions of what our goal is. You know, we're talking about like the development of virtues and this process orientation, but there's also this everlasting life goal. You know, there's so many different aspects of it. You know, it's quite mind-boggling, but
yes, this is exactly. I'm going there exactly tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of this problem. Is this partly an illusory problem, which has been defined by our limited perspective as separate things, as atomic entities, and then we sort of think of the world in a similar sense. But what are we really? What is the human reality really? You know, is it our bodies, our memories, our thoughts, our personalities, the things that we think are us? Is that really us? Or is us something deeper still? And this gets us into the question of, it connects to the question of consciousness through, and this is, I guess, previewing some of the content of tomorrow, of a concept that Baha'u'llah introduced. Well, Baha'u'llah doesn't introduce it. It's been around before. It's been around since even the Greek philosophers had this idea of something that Baha'u'llah calls the primal will. Also can be translated as the first intellect. is the primal consciousness, is the ultimate ground of things, which sounds a bit pantheistic, but there's always one step, from this primal will to the essence, about which nothing can be said. And I may scramble it in the attempt to sort of compress it to a few moments, but the basic idea is that our ultimate reality is, as it were, a wave upon the sea of the will. The sea hath ever been the sea, and all contingent things its waves and forms, is a line of poetry that Abdu'l-Bahá quotes in one of his tablets, and we'll be coming to this tomorrow. And if we could see ourselves for what we really are, which is a fragment of the divine, a spark of the divine, as Baha'u'llah describes it in the Hidden Words, turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee, mighty, powerful, and self-subsisting. That's our true reality, as a spark of the divine consciousness. That what we think of as us, these separate consciousnesses that are competing with each other, arranging with others in different groups that line up against other groups, this whole way that we configure our consciousnesses and identities is ultimately not the base reality. The base reality is the water of which we are all waves. But more on that to come.
Yes, thank you so much. Who else has, Björn, I see a hand. Can you unmute yourself? Oh, it's
approach to things, and you mentioned racism a few times, and I think modern racism was developed by the Portuguese in the 1500s. And the thing that's important is even black people took part in it, selling other black people. So I think racism is a means. The real gangster is rapacious capitalism that is driving it. And I think it's kind of important to have in the picture who is really to blame in the bottom. Racism is used to means. Yeah.
I hope to go into this in a couple of days, although I can quickly get out of my depth because I haven't done all the reading I should in this topic. But the fact that race is a social construction is something which people don't really appreciate how deep that rabbit hole goes. How what we take now to be these almost biological divisions between human beings was very much constructed around the 1500s and 1600s to help establish the ascendancy of a certain economic class. It was done for economic reasons.
Yes.
I mean, you want to categorize slaves as being other than human because then that enables you to exploit their labor and enables you to get rich off of it. But that's a whole big topic,
yes.
Huge topic.
Kirsten Brie, did you have your hand up? Oh, you just need to unmute yourself. Just a moment. Yeah. Okay. Now I've done it. It's quick.
This idea that you threw up about the scientific development, and comparing it to the development of going from multiple gods to monotheism, I thought that was kind of interesting because it's hard for me to imagine that, there could be more than one God. So I don't know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. It's hard. It was hard for me too until I thought in polytheistic in a polytheistic theology, each God represents a different attribute. And then you realize, well, actually, Baha'u'llah talks all the time about attributes of God. There's justice and wisdom and kindness and compassion, all of these. Those are the sort of articulations of the divine that as Baha'is we're very comfortable with. And these ancient societies that had these polytheistic theologies, it was simply that. It was the same thing. Zeus represents this and Apollo represents this and Artemis represents this. I may be mixing the Greek and Roman names, but or go to the Scandinavian gods, and Loki and Thor and all of these. They represent certain archetypes. And the
Okay.
archetypes ultimately represent certain values or certain virtues and certain vices. And those are become focal points. And it just makes total sense to me that the more primitive we are, the more we rely upon very tangible focal points for spiritual things. And as we become more and more advanced, we can start thinking about these things more subtly, until you get to the Baha'i faith and it becomes completely, all the focal points are being removed one by one. So now you don't even have any, you've removed all ritual from it now. And everything is abstracted at a level that we don't find even in other Judeo, in other religions, in say the Judeo-Christian lineage. And so you see again, looking throughout the sweep of history, an evolution in our spiritual thought and comprehension, how that is manifested in systems that moves from the concrete to the abstract.
That is true. Yes. I mean, the way I understood it, monotheism is really 2,000 years old at least. And I read once in the selected writings of Abdul Baha that Socrates traveled in Palestine, and that's where he learned about monotheism. And in fact, that was maybe the main reason why he was poisoned. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because Baha'u'llah attributes this idea of Socrates of the immortality of the soul, which is found in the dialogues of Plato. Baha'u'llah credits the Hebrew prophets for that idea. And in doing so, Baha'u'llah is repeating what some of the Arab historians of centuries before had also done, which is crediting the ultimately a divine source, namely the prophets of Israel, for the secular philosophy of the Greeks. Unfortunately, no record of this travel remains in the Greek sources. And so if you just read the surviving dialogues of Plato and the fragments we have about the life of Socrates, there's no mention that Socrates physically went to Palestine, although it is mentioned in the Arab histories. What we do know for certain is that there was a thriving Eastern Atlantic trade at that point, and had been for hundreds, if not thousands of years from the time of the ancient Phoenicians. So there was a huge mixture, not just of goods, olive oil and bronze and tin and all that sort of things that they're now digging up at the bottom of the Mediterranean and establishing these very rich and interconnected networks of trade. But certainly ideas go along with that. I mean, certainly ideas that were found in Israel would have entered onto a ship and made it to Greece and made it to Egypt and so forth. So we can be sure that there was a healthy interplay of ideas during that time. Whether or not a particular person physically went to a particular place is almost immaterial.
No, but Socrates was accused of misleading the youth by talking about one God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Kirsten Marie. Parto, your question was next.
Sorry, Steven. I promise I won't be here every day, so I'm using the floor again. Well, just first of all, about this topic of polytheism and monotheism. I mean, for example, just if you read let's say, Praise and Meditations of Baha'u'llah, everything in it, on one hand, bespeaks of one God, but at the same time, of the total unknowability of it. So fundamentally, I mean, even the attributes of God, I mean, the way we look at them, we think that, okay, God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, God is this and that. God is none of those things. God has created those qualities. God doesn't know everything. God has created every knowledge that can ever be and has even not been yet. So the whole thing, this whole concept, and Abdul Baha is very clear in some answer questions, which, by the way, Steven has been translating into English. Thank you for that. Finally, we have an accurate translation. Is that even ordinary things cannot be known by anything else than their attributes, not by their essence, let alone God, whose essence is beyond any understanding. So anything we know is the attributes of God, and anything we achieve is achieving the attributes of God. So in that sense, the polytheistic view has truth in it. It just doesn't spit out the whole thing. So I think it's helpful for Baha'is, then we can be much more understanding when we're talking with polytheistic people. One completely other thing, there was a mention about capitalism and that. I just want to make this point. Just exactly a week ago, there was a message from the Universal House of Justice to the American Baha'is. Stephen, I'm sure you have had it already, have you? And that and the 9th of May message, I really recommend people reading it. We are not anti-capitalist as Baha'is. Indeed, the writings say that there's nothing, Shoghi Effendi says in these words, there is nothing in the Baha'i writings against some form of capitalism, whereas there is a lot in the writings about most forms of socialism and communism. So if anything, we are leaning that way, but we are not, of course, leaning anyway. It's just that it happens to be that some aspects of capitalism are in accordance with the teachings, whereas most aspects of socialism, although not all, are not in congruence with. So, of course, its current forms, Shoghi Effendi says, have to be adjusted and modified because they are, of course, mostly based on greed. But capitalism by itself, it has become a swear word for all Europeans and definitely all Nordic people. Let's be careful. Baha'is shouldn't go with the flow and the flock. We have the writings as the standard. We follow the writings. We don't follow the whims and popularity of this and that current view. I'm sorry for being so strong, but I work in the academia, in the human sciences, and in heart, I'm a natural scientist. So I really, really advise Baha'is to be very careful with what you think about socialism and capitalism and all of that. So sorry.
I think the problem is, the real problem is much deeper than capitalism, socialism, communism. Those are all structures that are built upon sets of assumptions about human nature and how people act. And that's what we're about changing. I mean, if we are successful in our project and we're able to elevate human consciousness to the next level, which involves a wider embrace and a way of thinking about the other, which recognizes the organic unity of the human race, then the kinds of incentive structures that are in play are going to work differently. I mean, capitalism works, especially under free market capitalism, with minimal or no governmental controls, like laissez-faire capitalism, ultimately ends when people are primarily motivated by greed, will end with vast disparities between the rich and the poor. It's like it's an unstable equilibrium. Right? Things just get worse and worse unless you impose some sort of structures or controls to sort of rein in that natural sort of division between the haves and the have-nots, which capitalism, just as a tool with the free markets, enables those divisions to just become wider and wider. What it seems to me that our project is it's not so much changing the structure and the policies and so forth. It's more changing the outlooks behind it. If we can make people a little bit less greedy, if we can make people think a little bit more about their neighbor than they did before, that small change in attitude about people, about what's really important. Is maximizing profit really the most important thing for this company to do? And if that changes just a little bit, then we might see sort of exponential changes in the sort of radiating out from that in the world. It seems to me that ought to be our focus more than the critique of particular systems.
Thank you.
Parto, I think, is commenting on it, but
the next person is Anne-Grete.
You're muted.
Did you have a question?
It was not a question, actually.
Or comment?
It was just a sentence about goals. And you said something about it was better to be expressed in this moment than have a lot of goals before you. And I thought of Aristoteles. He said something about happiness is not something you should reach in the end of our lives. It must be a way of living. And yes, I just wanted to share that point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. I certainly don't want to be misunderstood at saying that, you know, setting goals is the wrong thing to do, but definitely want to would underline that statement by Aristotle about, you know, happiness, spirituality, whatever it is we think the purpose of our life is not something that we wake up one day and say, I've achieved it. You know, it's something that we live in every moment. You know, living in the presence of God in every moment is the purpose of life, not waking up a year from now or 10 years from now and having reached enlightenment. That being said, you know, there are stages in human consciousness. There are moments that one has where one comes to a new awareness of things. So in that sense, I think it's, you know, it's both and neither. I remember having this long discussion actually with Parto a few years ago. You know, is it, what's the nature of human, of spiritual progress? Is this, you know, is it reaching, is it like going from valley to valley and you want to get to valley number 7 or 8 or however many valleys there are? Or is it waking up every day and living in the, as fully as one can in the presence of the divine as one perceives it at that time?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Grace, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I had a comment, and that's I feel that there is I'd like to set this straight just briefly, because I feel that it's particularly in the US there's a big misconception of our understanding of what how we view socialism in the Nordic countries. So we're not against capitalism, but we see more in our societies that we'd like to have some kind of social equality. People can earn money and become rich, and there are people who are rich, but the society focuses on providing, making sure that everyone is provided for. And I think that is absolutely a very good goal to have, to make sure that the poor, the poorest in society are taken care of.
Yes, good.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know who put their hand up first. So it was Daniel and Runa. So Runa, would you like to start?
I think it's
Okay, so Runa or Tom. Sorry. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Yes, I had a, sorry, it's Tom. I'm allowed to sit with Runa here. No question. Some years ago we had, in Denmark, we had this UN COP meeting where it was all about climate, and I was looking forward to it. It was amazing, and Arthur were coming and all kind of people. And all we ever talked about as Baha'i was the social construction, how to equalize the social differences. And what I hear for you, Steven, is that is that a part of this, you know, changing the way of looking at how we live together and what we are, and not as much that in a sense can level out, you know, the imbalance, not only economic but also climate and education and so forth.
There's something that that Abdu'l-Baha said that I think gets close to the answer, and it's a very challenging thing, where he talks about the real solution to the problem of the disparity between rich and poor. And Abdu'l-Baha says this in so many different ways, basically the same thing, that I don't think it's an accident, but he says ultimately that it can't, the equalization of the of this disparity cannot be done through force, he said. It cannot be done through governments taking from the rich and giving to the poor. He said it has to be done through voluntary giving, which seems like it's like incredibly either incredibly optimistic or naive in sort of in the face of our current understanding of how people are motivated and how people choose, to distribute their own wealth. It seems to me that Abdu'l-Baha is referring to a future state of society where our consciousness has been so elevated that, as he says, one could not bear the thought that one's neighbor was suffering and in want. And once we reach that stage, then the disparity between rich and poor will resolve itself in a more natural way, because rich people will just couldn't sleep at night knowing that there's this kind of suffering in the world that they could help alleviate by giving their wealth away. At the moment, though, we haven't reached that state of consciousness. And so it has to be taxation schedules and governments basically forcing that equalization, because we haven't yet reached that level of consciousness that it's done voluntarily. So, well, where does one go from that? I suppose one could say that in the short term, these principles, more socialistic principles, may be what's needed in the short term, because the consciousness hasn't reached the level where it can happen the way that Abdu'l-Baha suggests it ought to happen, but which is more for a future state of society, which is that that these problems are solved in a more organic and unforced way. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's a challenging thought to me. I think about that a lot, about the voluntary giving as a basis for a future society. It seems crazy,
but you had that in America. I don't think it works that well.
Yeah, charity is a big part of the social contract in the U.S. Yeah.
Daniel, you're next.
And it's proving quite inadequate in many ways. I think the best way to look at it is to say that neither socialism nor capitalism are systems that we see operating in the future. In the future, neither of those categories will be labels that will adequately explain what this future system, what it will look like. But I think in some answered questions, Abdu'l-Baha addresses the issue of strikes. And in this context, he talks about workers owning factories and this being a structure. So that, at least to me, sounds more like socialism, in the sense of the people owning the means of productions. But I want to set that aside. And the actual point I wanted to make was about the idea of God in the past, in antiquity. I was just reading this book on Christianity and paganism, that where the authors, a chapter in or so, he says, if you go away from this book with anything, I want you to go away with this. People of antiquity had no unified idea of what a god was. And this is why we can have the idea of Caesar being a god. One of the Roman emperors could elevate themselves to God, because there was modern people say, how could people of antiquity think that this human person was a god? That's ridiculous. But the constraint of what a god was so nebulous in antiquity that it was possible.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
The next is Jane Dole.
It's interesting to see where the world. Oh, sorry. It's difficult to. It's interesting to see where the world is at the moment, because just a few days ago, one of a very wealthy Dane had suggested a tax for the very rich, those who are billionaires or milliardaires or whatever, those who have a lot of money, but they were taxed 1% of their income a year. And if they were, it would actually, it would finance the UN UNICEF budget. And he said, why would the rich do that? He had already gathered 250 of people in his league that were backing the idea for the UN. And he said, why should we do that? And we should do that, he said, because the disparity between rich and poor is a factor of uncertainty. And this is something that the rich people hate. It is uncertainty. So we should do it for our own security. And it's an interesting point that the world actually is starting realizing, not out of a moral dimension, but out of a security dimension.
Enlightened self-interest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
The next person is Harto.
Sorry, you don't get rid of me. I just recommend people to read a a compilation made by the research department of the Universal House of Justice called Economics, Agriculture, and Related Subjects. I'm going to put it here in the PDF format in the chat place here, so you can actually download it for yourself if you like. If you read it carefully, you will just notice that the Baha'i concept, let's forget about capitalism and socialism, it doesn't matter. The Baha'i concept is fundamentally based on morality. That's like Steven was saying. It's not based on system. The system should not, you know, we in the Nordic countries are completely pampered that the system has taken the role of individual responsibility. And that's called, I would even slightly disagree with you, Steven, in that it might even be needed now because it has made us morally lazy. We don't have even the challenge of taking care of our people. When my father died and we decided with my sister and my mother that my mother would go and live with my sister, the system couldn't even allow that properly. We had to go through hell to make it even happen. Of course, you will put your old mother to the elderly people's homes and so on. That's socialism. Karl Marx specifically said that the state must not trust the individuals and the citizens' morality. They may or may not be moral, but the state cannot trust that. The Baha'i system is the opposite of that. And that's why
I totally agree.
Mess, because the capitalism is based on lack of morality. And indeed, you mentioned, Daniel, about the Abdul Baha's comment on strikes. You have to be very careful what you read. He didn't say about co-ownership. He said that the workers should get 1/4 or 1/5 of the profit of the factory or the owners. He specifically said that capital and labor are interdependent, not the same thing. It's actually very capitalistic in that sense. Okay, we shouldn't call it capitalistic because it's not capitalistic, but it's definitely not socialistic either. It's not co-ownership. They will get a bonus of the profit between 20 and 25% of the profit of the factory. And this is we have to be very careful about these things. The same way that we are not pacifists, but most Baha'i think we are pacifists. We do believe in weapons, and in fact in using them globally when needed. I won't go into it, but there's a lot of stories on that. So for me, it's just that we really should go into the writings and not just have a vague understanding, but actually go to the details of the writing. Otherwise, we will get really confused in this really messy world we are living in at the moment.
Mm.
Sorry
Thank you
for
very
being so
much.
talkative.
Are there any other questions or comments? Duncan?
Yeah, I'm not going to go into these system issues that have been discussed. I just wanted to sort of take some steps back to think about what Stephen's presenting in terms of some of the sources, like Tabernacle of Unity and these kind of things, more recently translated writings, because I don't know very much, but I sometimes wonder, why has the House of Justice had those writings translated, for instance? You know, and this whole thing of kind of reflecting on the search for truth, this kind of multiplicity of truth, and it's kind of coming out now in our own understanding, I guess, of the writings and how we correlate it with current systems of the world and so on. I mean, I also work in a university. Anytime you start discussing anything, people want to pull you into one of these ways that they understand the world, you know, and this way of trying to, I don't know yet what's coming in the future sessions about what the narrative is going to be, but just to think about it as a kind of narrative of this impelling of consciousness, and that all these systems are underpinned by this sort of progressive development of consciousness and so on, is it's an easier direction to take it than some of these kind of existing ways of thinking, which have a tendency towards becoming very divisive. And that's not what we want. We don't end up in shouting arguments either with each other or certainly with people we're trying to tell about the faith. So yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of where it's going, but it kind of explains for me why are these writings being translated, because they give a clearer sense of this kind of whatever it is, hierarchy of understanding, or different ways of things being somehow simultaneously different partial expressions of the truth. So I'm very much happy about that. I'd love to discuss the other things in some other context, because it's great, because I'm also in sort of a political science department at the moment. But yeah, great. I just wanted to kind of give a thanks for that again, for the kind of central thing of things.
Yeah, thanks. The Call of the Divine Beloved, which is the most recent volume of well, actually not the most recent, but second most recent, is for me so much more than a mystical volume. I mean, it's the keys to solving social ills of the world to me. I mean, through this introduction of the idea of multiple valid spiritual narratives, which may seem to be just completely at odds with each other, and Baha'u'llah, it just acknowledges that right out, And in Gems of Divine Mysteries, which was translated a few years before that, he even goes so far as to say that seekers in one valley may regard the seekers in the other valley as blasphemers, and those in the other valley, consider their counterparts likewise, and that's. But Baha'u'llah says, but each of them is true and correct within their own frame of reference. It's such an amazing thing for a prophet to say. I mean, you expect a prophet to sort of lay down the law and say this is true and that's false, and make everything all hard-edged and separate black from white. And Baha'u'llah's not doing that. He's leaving all the shades of gray, which is what you have to do if you're in a world where total doctrinal conformity is not an option. And we don't live in that sort of a world. We live in a world in which there is an intrinsic and irreducible diversity of approaches. And Baha'u'llah is giving us the conceptual foundations, and this is worked into even the individual mystical texts where you would think you're least likely to find it. Okay, this is all about the individual search and the individual's relationship with God, but really what you're seeing in these mystical texts are keys to a far greater social ills of humanity.
Thank you. I'm curious to know if there's any more. Oh, sorry, Bjorn.
Yeah, I'm sorry for having started this discussion about capitalism and socialism. It wasn't my intention. But as I have understood it, the Baha'i faith is a religion. It's not an economic system or theory. We have a few economic principles, but they are rather general. And we also have a principle of unity in diversity. Maybe Denmark and United States don't have to have the same economic system in the future either. We need pragmatism and experimentation and a much more dynamic vision, I think, not just it should be this is this. At least I believe so. And I think there is a letter from the House of Justice that says we will have a long process with economists becoming Baha'is and Baha'is becoming economists, and gradually our understanding will grow, but this is far into the future, I think, slowly. So sorry about that.
No problem, thank you.
All right.
Yeah, it made me have the thought myself that this idea of looking towards the positive, even when Abdu'l Baha says look to the positive what somebody is, and then there could be 10 bad qualities that you don't look at, and it makes me think of this diversity or this grey sense of Baha'u'llah not saying there's one thing is right, because there has to be space for all those 10 wrong things that people go around and think, Anna Greta?
When I first became a Baha'i, it was because of the justice. I think you cannot find any system or anything else that have that built into its sort of concept. The justice, it's everywhere. in the Baha'i faith when you read the text and so on. So even in economic, there is more justice than in anywhere else in the world.
Thank you very much. I think unless Stephen, you want to give a final comment, then I think we should finish now. And I probably should have finished about 10 minutes ago. But thank you so much for both a wonderful talk and for wonderful answers to our questions. And thank you also to all those people who asked questions and gave comments.
Look forward to tomorrow. It's gonna move more from this attempted sort of historical analysis and get more mystical.